This section will deal with continuous measurement procedures. Measuring behavior, continuous measurement procedures. Continuous measurement procedures means that you are measuring continuously throughout. You are collecting data on every behavior response. Some examples of this are frequency or rate, duration, latency, and magnitude. Frequency and rate are synonymous terms. They're interchangeable. Rate, though, you do have to calculate, and we'll talk about how to do that in a minute. These are all continuous measurement procedures. Remember, that means that we're measuring continuously throughout the session, and we're collecting data on every behavioral response. Frequency or rate is simply the number of times behavior occurs, with rate being the number of times a behavior occurs for some time frame. In applied behavior analysis, frequency and rate are interchangeable. They're synonymous. So, if you know about baseball and you see on the scoreboard that a team has 10 hits, the frequency of hits in that game was 10. Frequency is good for behaviors that have a clear beginning and end, and that are not happening at high rates in succession, and don't last a long time. The behavior should have a clear beginning and end, though, so that you can mark each instance of it. If a behavior is happening at high rates in succession, it may be impossible to count each one. If a behavior is lasting a long time, if it's just one behavior, that would not give us accurate measure. For example, I would not do frequency on crying. Because what if I get the data back and I say, well, this person only cried one time today, but that crying session lasted like 2 hours. Duration would be a better measure for that, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Frequency, though, is just the number of times a behavior occurs, and it is a continuous measurement procedure. So, let's say, for example, that we're going to record each instance of Joe hitting the table with his hand. Now, another important part about frequency or rate, or whenever we're taking data on behavior, we want to have that behavior operationally defined so that we can give this data sheet with a little bit of training to someone else, and they would be able to record that. So in this example, record each instance of Joe hitting the table with his hand. That's a pretty accurate measure, or a pretty accurate definition. I want the definition to be as detailed enough so that if we gave it to someone else, they'd be able to take the same kind of data. So, let's say on 6/1/16, he hits his head, or hand rather, on the table 4 times. You would mark down 4 times, 3 times on the second, and on the third, 5 times. That's all taking frequency data requires, is to be able to mark how many times each instance of the behavior occurred. Now I do want you to be familiar with how to calculate rate from frequency. Rate is the number of occurrences per some time frame. This is especially useful if the observation times are different. For example, let's say I observe a patient for 5 hours, but someone else can only observe 2 hours. It would be unfair to compare the frequencies directly, as I was there for longer. So, for example, let's say I observe a patient for 5 hours, but someone can only observe for 2 hours. Okay, rate is calculated by taking the number and dividing it by the time frame. So, if an observation session lasts 5 hours and I see 10 behaviors, I would take the number of behaviors 10 and divide by the number of hours 5. 10 divided by 5 would equal 2. I could say the behavior has a rate of 2 behaviors per hour. So again, you take the number of behaviors and divide it by whatever the time frame is. So let's do another one. Let's say I see 32 behaviors in a 45-minute session. I want to know the number of behaviors per minute. So we take the number of behaviors and divide by the time frame. In this case, I would take 32, which is the number of behaviors, and divide it by 45, which is the number of minutes. This gives me a rate of 0.71 behaviors per minute. Let's say I go back a couple days later and I was able to do a 2-hour session. In the 2-hour session, there were 78 behaviors. What would the rate be? Well, I'm going to take the number of behaviors, 78, and I'm going to divide by the number of minutes. Now remember, this can get a little tricky, right? You want to remember to calculate the number of minutes here. So how many minutes are in 2 hours? Well, I know there's 60 minutes per hour, and there's 2, so I take 60 and multiply it by 2, which gives us 120. So make sure to be able to transfer times like that if you're doing this. So I know there's 120 minutes. So I take 78 and I divide by 120, and I get a rate of 0.65 behaviors per minute. So here you can see that even though the second day had more behaviors, the rate was actually lower. And this illustrates why rate is important to calculate sometimes. We want to make sure, if we're looking at data accurately, we want to make sure that we're comparing it in a similar manner. So if I just compared 32 to 78, I would think that the person had more behaviors on the second day. Whereas when I calculated rate, I noticed it was a little bit lower actually. The important part for the RBT, I want you to realize how to calculate rate, which is the number of behaviors divided by the time frame. Duration. Duration is a measure of how long a behavior lasts, so you're going to need a way to measure it, such as a stopwatch or most likely a phone. It gives us the length of time of the behavior. It can be reported as an individual or total. It's good for behaviors that are occurring rapidly in succession at high rate or that last a long time. It is a continuous measurement procedure. For example, we could measure the length of time that someone is engaged in a tantrum. Right? We wouldn't necessarily just want the frequency, because what if the person only had one tantrum, but that was like a 45-minute tantrum? We can report duration as either total per session or individual behaviors. All total per session is the duration added together for the session. So for example, if time 1 or tantrum 1 lasted 3 minutes, tantrum 2 lasted 5 minutes, and tantrum 3 lasted 2 minutes, I could say the total duration per session was 7 minutes. Latency. Latency is a measure that looks at the amount of time between the instruction and the behavior occurring. We will use this when the person can do the behavior, but it takes too long to maybe start engaging in it after being asked. Here at Learning Arts, we don't take a lot of latency measures, but I want you to be familiar with it. It is a form of continuous measurement as you are recording each instance of a behavior. So for example, Dad tells his daughter, "Put your shoes on." You would measure the amount of time between the instruction, so the dad is saying put the shoes on, and the daughter actually putting her shoes on. So if it was 2 minutes, the data might just look simply like this: latency 2 minutes. Again, the analyst is going to provide data sheets for you for each one of these. Now, magnitude or intensity. This isn't really a formal way to do continuous measurement, but it is a good way to define behavior. This is how strong the behavior is. You report typically by narrative or writing it in how intense the behavior is. This can be good for behaviors that can have varying intensities. Hitting objects, for example. I once worked with an individual who would hit things. Most of the time it was very soft, but occasionally he would hit stuff really hard. So I had the technicians tell me what the intensity was. Was it low, medium, or high, I would ask. Sometimes the analyst will quantify it by having you rate it. 1 low, 2 medium, 3 high. Again, it will depend on the analyst and the patient. Again, for continuous measurement, you are measuring continuously throughout. You're collecting data of every behavior response. Frequency or rate, remember those are synonymous, duration, latency, and magnitude are all ways we can measure throughout the session. Be familiar for the RBT exam what each one of these are and how you might measure it. Remember, frequency, you're just measuring the number of times. Duration, you're keeping track of how long the behavior lasts. Latency, you're keeping track of how long between the instruction and the actual behavior occurring. And with magnitude, you're making a rating based on its intensity. Another way of measuring behavior is through discontinuous measurement procedures. Contrast that with continuous measurement procedures. Discontinuous measurement procedures means that we're going to measure samples, or not every instance of the behavior per session. There are 3 primary types of discontinuous measurement procedures: partial interval measures, whole interval measures, and momentary time sampling. So before we talk about the different types, I want to make sure that you know what an interval is. When I say an interval, what I mean is a length of time. In applied behavior analysis, we're going to try to make, for comparison's sake, intervals always to be the same amount of time between what we're comparing. So for example, I would not compare something that had a 30-second interval to something that had a 10-second interval. We would want to make them equal. Basically, we're striving when we're comparing to be comparing 2 of the same things. But for this discussion's sake, for an RBT, I want you to know that an interval is a length of time. So, let's say I break a minute into 2 30-second periods. I could say each is a 30-second interval. From this, we'll be able to calculate a percentage of time the behavior occurred. So, an example result might say something like this: the patient was in seat 55% of the time. Again, from these discontinuous measures, we'll be able to calculate a percentage of time that the behavior occurred, and we can compare across time. Partial and whole interval recording and momentary time sampling gives us an estimation of the number of behaviors that are occurring or that the individual engages in. These are nice because we don't have to record every single instance of a behavior, but we do have to have a little bit of setup, and we'll go over that here in a minute. So, before we start examples, let's select our interval length. Let's say that we're going to do a 10-minute observation, and then we're going to break this into 20 intervals. Remember, we're going to make those intervals the same length. The intervals will be then 30 seconds. So we will have 20 30-second intervals. Here's what an example chart might look like. Notice there are 20 intervals on there. Now a real one is probably going to have a lot more instructions on it. For example, what your interval is going to be and what behavior you're looking at. But this is just for illustration purposes. Another consideration when using these measurements is you're going to want to have something that can non-intrusively tell you when an interval is up. I myself am a little old school. I use what's called a motivator. It gives you a little buzz, and you can set for different interval lengths. To be honest with you, I'm not sure if there's any phone app that does that. Although I'm sure there is, where you can set like a stopwatch or something that buzzes every 30 seconds or every 20, whatever the interval length is. But basically you want it to be non-intrusive. If you're simply just doing an observation, such as in a classroom, you may be able to use like the watch or the clock or something on the second hand. That may not be quite as accurate as you might like. But basically you're going to want to have something that can signal you when each interval is done. Another thing I like to do is to make sure that every interval is marked, whether a behavior occurred or not. Now you'll see in the examples in a few minutes what it's going to look like. But here, this example, see that X right there? I might put that, and it helps me to keep track of what interval I'm on. So, for example, if a behavior did not occur in interval 1, I might just put the X before I move on to interval 2. So like when the buzz goes off, when I know the interval's up, I'll put an X just so I know that nothing occurred in that interval and that I'm also currently on interval 2. That's just a practice I do. You don't need to do that, but it helps to keep track of what interval you're on. So now we can talk about what these actually are. Whole interval recording. In a whole interval recording, the behavior must occur for the whole interval for the interval to be marked as having the behavior occurred. This will give us an underestimation of the behavior because it has to happen for the whole interval. So, for example, let's say we're doing in-seat behavior, which is what we're going to track here. For it to be marked, the person would have to be in seat the entire interval. So let's say the person sits in the seat for 29 seconds but gets up. Because it wasn't for the whole interval, we don't mark it as occurring. This is why it gives us an underestimation of behavior. As an analyst, personally, I use this for tracking desired behavior because I'd rather have an underestimation of that, because if we see an improvement, that means something really is going on. Although this is not a rule. I want to stress that. It's not a rule. What kind of recording you're going to use is going to depend on what the analyst tells you to use. So, for this example, we're going to do in-seat behavior. If you notice that on the top, there's an operational definition of what that means. JM has to be in a seat with feet on the ground. This is what the chart would look like filled out. Remember, I'm using those X's to keep track of where I'm at. So, in interval 1, in all the 30 seconds, for the whole interval, he was not in seat. Same for interval 2. But interval 3, you see I put that plus. And so remember, that's a strategy I use to mark intervals that are already over with the X. If you do that, make sure that the mark that you're doing for an interval where the actual behavior occurred looks different. So here I use a plus. So on this example chart, pluses equal the behavior occurred, X means it did not occur. So remember, for me to mark that plus, the behavior would have had to have occurred through the whole 30-second interval. So JM was in his seat for the whole 30 seconds in interval 3. And that's how it would look filled out. So as you can see on there, in interval 3, 5, 6, 11, 14, 15, 18, and 19, JM was in his seat for the entire 30-second interval. From here, I can calculate a percentage of intervals. So let's do that. Percentage of intervals. We're going to take the number of intervals that it occurred in. So here, there was 8 intervals that were marked as the behavior occurring. And we're going to divide by the total number of intervals, which was 20. And we're going to multiply that by 100 to get the percentage of intervals. So we're going to take that 8, we're going to divide it by 20. This gives us an answer of 0.4. Then we're going to multiply that by 100. This gives us 40. So we can say that in 40% of intervals, the patient was in seat. Partial interval recording. The behavior must occur only one time during the interval for the interval to be marked. This gives us an overestimation of behavior because it only has to happen once during the interval. Sorry, my throat was a little raspy there, so I'll read that again. The behavior must occur only one time during the interval for the interval to be marked. This gives us an overestimation of the behavior because it only has to happen once during the interval. So in our example, Jam only has to be in the seat, let's say, for 2 seconds out of that 30 seconds, and we can mark it as occurring. As an analyst, I sometimes will use this with problematic behavior to overestimate how much is actually happening. But again, that's not a rule. So here, I'm going to mark each instance. Don't compare this to the last graph. This is totally different. They're different chart. So, as you can see, I put the pluses and x's. Remember, the pluses are corrects, or that means the behavior occurred sometime in that interval, and the x is just me tracking what interval I'm on. So again, in partial interval recording, all the person has to do is engage in the behavior at any time during the interval, and it's marked as occurring. So let's say in interval 1, he was only in his seat for 3 seconds. But because it's partial interval, again, partial, it only has to occur one time or more during that interval, we'll mark it as happening. Again, we can calculate a percentage of intervals. Here, there were 12 pluses. That means that in 12 of the intervals, at some point during those intervals, he was engaged in in-seat behavior. So we're going to take that number 12, divide it by 20, it gets 0.6. That times it by 100, so we can say that in 60% of intervals, that patient was in their seat. Finally, we come to momentary time sampling. Here, the person only checks to see if the behavior is occurring at the time the interval is up. So in our example, they will be checking every 30 seconds. The signal or buzz will go off, and they will mark if the person was engaged in the behavior or not. Use the same data sheet. It is also discontinuous measurement because you're not measuring each instance of the behavior. It underestimates behavior, but momentary time sampling is good in instances when the observer is engaged elsewhere or very busy. Typically when I'm having teachers record data, this is the most popular one because they don't have time because they have a ton of other students to keep track of. So basically what I'm telling them is that, hey, like every time, like let's say a minute or 45 seconds, look up and see if the person is engaged in the behavior. They mark if they were or they don't or not. Here we're doing 30 seconds, remember. So I would tell the person at the 30-second point, look up. If the person is engaged in the behavior, mark the interval as it haven't occurred. If not, just keep track of what interval you're on. I put the X's, so there it is right there. It would look the same. The data sheet would look the same. So in interval 1, the person looked up at the 30-second point. Jam was not in their seat, so they put an X. interval 2 occurred. So at the 30-second point of interval 2, so now we're a whole minute into it, looked up, JM was not in their seat, so they mark X. At the minute and 30 point, so the next 30-second interval is up, they look up, and JM was in his seat, so they would put a plus. Likewise in 4, 5, and 6, the teacher looked up, or the observer looked up, and each one of those, when the interval was over, JM was in his seat. So as you can see, the person only has a 10 once that signal goes off to see if the person is engaged in the behavior. We could do the same thing and calculate a percentage of intervals. Here, there was 11 times he was in his seat when the teacher or observer looked up. We take that 11, divide by 20, which gets us 0.55, and multiply that by 100, gets us 55. So we can say through MTS, or momentary time sampling, he was in his seat 55% of the observation. Discontinuous measurement procedures. We measure the samples of the behavior. We're not measuring every instance. Remember, like in whole interval, we're not measuring every instance of the behavior. We're just seeing if the behavior occurred at all during for the whole interval. So if it's this 30-second interval and the behavior occurred for 10 seconds and they stopped, so let's say JM got out of his seat, we no longer have to record whether he sits back down in his seat again in 5 seconds because we know that whole interval doesn't count. And in partial interval, once he sits down one time in that interval, that's the only one we have to look at. So let's say he sits down one time, stays in his seat for 5 seconds, gets up for like 10 seconds, sits back down. We're not keeping track of each instance of the behavior. We already marked that interval as occurring because it was partial interval. He already did it. In a momentary time sampling, we're only seeing at the 30-second point or whatever the point is. So in that way, we're not measuring every single instance of behavior. Again, we're estimating, or this is an estimation. We use discontinuous measurement in ABA to give us an estimation, a percentage, and it allows us to do a percentage of intervals that behavior is occurring in. We can compare these percentages over time. We can say that at the beginning of the year, JM was in his seat 55% of intervals. By October, he was in his seat 70% of intervals. But remember, when we're comparing across time, we're going to want to be using the same intervals. So I would use in October the same amount of or same 30-second interval as I did at the beginning of the year. And I would use the same type of measurement. So if I use partial interval at the beginning of the year, I'm going to use partial interval in October. So essentially, we're comparing across time. As an RBT, you should be familiar with discontinuous measurement procedures and what they are and how to do it. You should be familiar that if it's a whole interval recording, the behavior has to recur throughout the whole interval. If it is partial interval, you know that the behavior only has to occur once throughout that interval. And if it's momentary time sampling, you're checking to see if the behavior is occurring at whatever the prescribed interval length is. You should know that partial interval behavior, or partial interval recording, creates an overestimation of the behavior, and that whole interval recording creates an underestimation of the behavior, amount of behavior.